All right. I want to welcome everyone to another episode of Public Leadership Institute's online webinars. This particular session is called Poll Tested Method to Rally Public for an Activist Government. And hopefully the title and description intrigued you enough to want to be able to join us to talk about some really exciting new research to make the case and to better frame the role of government in protecting our communities, protecting our lives, and meeting voters where they are in what they believe that government should be functioning and doing. My name is Dave Woodward. I will be your host for today's presentation and be supporting and facilitating the conversation. I'm Public Leadership Institute's National Network Director. In addition to that, I'm also a county official and a former state legislator, and I want to again thank you all for joining us all around the country. Before I hand over the reins to the gentleman who will take us through this presentation, I want to just give a little bit of background. Public Leadership Institute's a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy and leadership organization that's really designed to bring attention to key issues around equity and justice, and to work with public leaders to develop their skills to be more effective in advancing and improving the economic and social conditions for all people. You can get all of this information, including the information that we're talking today, at publicleadershipinstitute.org, where you'll also find a host of publications that Bernie Horns will probably make also reference to, that we make available to help support champions, policymakers, elected officials, etc. around the country to be more effective in moving the needle in the direction of social and economic opportunity. Before we get this presentation underway, I want to bring your attention to some features on your control panel. We really want these sessions to be as value-added as possible. To that end, we've got a number of ways to bring your thoughts, question, ideas into the conversation. If you are joining us from a place where you have audio capability, you can click at the hand icon at any time and raise your hand, and Bernie will pause frequently to be able to allow time for you to ask your question or get clarity on a lot of the information that's being presented this afternoon. If you're not in a place, and I know people are joining us from all different types of places, and it might be easier to type questions in, please do so. And when we do pause for questions, we'll try to get through as many of those as possible. And my email, dwoodward@publicleadershipinstitute.org, is on the screen there. Feel free to email me if there are any questions related to this presentation. I'd also like to bring your attention on your control panel. You should see a link of a handout. We get a number of requests to have the slide, and because particularly this slide is very information intense and a lot of polling information, we want to make sure that that was available to everyone who is joining us, and so you should you can download that directly from the control panel. We'll also have that information up on our website. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce someone who's no stranger to Public Leadership Institute, Bernie Horn, who's the Senior Advisor of Public Leadership Institute, former Policy Director, Communication Trainer, author of a lot of the resources that PLI makes available to all of you on a regular basis. Bernie, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Dave.
All right. Well, let's jump right in. I will hand over controls to you and take us into this conversation about making the case for government to be a part of the solution in advancing the progressive policy change that we're seeking in our communities.
Absolutely, and thanks very much. And you can see my screen, right?
Yep.
Very good. So before I launch into this, I just want to put in a plug for our website. This is at publicleadershipinstitute.org, and our site has the progressive agenda, which covers a dozen issue topics and links to 200 different model bills. It has our playbook for abortion rights that includes 29 proactive abortion rights model bills that covers both states and localities. And we have a messaging book, Voicing Our Values, that gives practical advice for talking about dozens of issues. So come to this website at your convenience and look around. I'll bet you'll find things that are useful to you. Language matters. That's because politics is the art of persuasion. When we attempt to persuade, what we say is heard differently by different people. And it makes a difference whether you get your audience listening for rational arguments or whether you take it off the track and people are just reacting with their emotions. In the big picture, progressive policy requires people to accept or embrace an activist government. Conservatives want to get government out of certain areas, usually so the rich can make more money. Progressives want government to step in and ensure that every American has access to a level playing field and fundamental rights and protections. So today, this presentation is divided into 3 parts. First, I'm going to talk about the problem.
Bernie, can I interrupt you for a second? I think I'm having a hard time seeing your screen. It's like something that's, I think it's like scrambled stuff. So I'm going to take back control and hand it right back to you.
That would be good.
1 second here.
Fortunately, nothing important has been on the screen yet.
There we go. There you go. You should be able to accept it. Sorry about that, everyone.
All right.
All right.
Tell me if that's a problem again. So first I'll talk about the problem as it's been perceived for years, that the average American is very cynical about government, and that creates a major barrier to progressive policy. And I'll give some suggestions about how to handle that class problem, which still exists. And then I'm going to stop for questions after that first part. Then I'm going to bring in a Celinda Lake poll and how that changes our perception of the problem and gives us some new ways to talk about government, regulation, and enforcement. And then I'll take questions a second time. Third, I'll go over messaging strategy from this poll and examples of the best language to use, and I'll stop a third time. So you'll have 3 chances to question. I encourage you to write questions in the box anytime or raise your hand at any time, and Dave will moderate. So, you know, demonizing government has been a long-time conservative strategy. If they can get people to hate government, or it seems like that to lawmakers, then they can stop progressive laws. And yes, when asked in an abstract or generalized way, a lot of people don't like the word government. That's even more true of words like Washington, which is a slur, or bureaucracy, which has always been an insult. So let's start by looking at some of the conventional polling. This is the current problem. Only 19% trust the federal government. Now, I want to point out 2 things. One is the big drop from 60%, which is after 9/11, occurred when George W. Bush was president. It was at 25% when Obama took office. And 2, the big gain from 17%, that was under Bill Clinton. Unfortunately, you know, the fact that people liking government went up under the Democrat and went down under the Republican, it just doesn't help us. As the Pew Center writes, the American public is deeply cynical about government, politics, and a nation's elected leaders. So no matter who caused it, we're stuck with a problem. Here's a classic poll question about regulation. It sort of looks bad, but note two things. First, before Obama, Americans used to average about 61 to 37 in favor of regulation. And now it's about 50-50. When you add too little and right amount together, you get 49 to 49 right now. So it's not that bad. But here's what really happened. People rarely change their beliefs, what really is inside them. This is a smear of Obama, really. Conservative media partisanized things that used to be bipartisan. So the word regulation just became something that Republicans thought they were supposed to oppose. Whether they do in fact or when you're specific is a different matter. But when you ask about, quote, regulation, unquote, Republicans who used to be okay turned very much against. But this isn't about what people actually believe or not. It's their reaction to the word, the partisanization of language. The same thing happened with gun control. Republicans overwhelmingly favor, let's say, background checks for all purchases, and even licensing for all gun purchases. But if you ask them about, quote, gun control, unquote, they're against. So, but the underlying beliefs are still there. This has been very much linked to the federal level. It's not so true of state and local government. If you look at the difference from 1997 to the present, you see that it's really been going up and down, much more so with the federal government. State government, local government are not too far from where they were 20 years ago. The point is that if you're talking about state or local government, you do not have the same anti-government problem that people talking about the federal government have. And, maybe you already understand that, but this is the first slide from the Celinda Lake poll that I'm going to feature in a minute. People simply don't have the problem with state government that they do with the federal government. You see, your state government, people are 53 to 37% in favor. The federal government, people are 61 to 32% opposed. And this is just favorable, unfavorable. Again, this has limited real importance, but I'm just showing that, if you're talking about state or local government is actually more popular than state, you don't even start out with much of a problem. So even when people don't like government in the abstract, people like what government does. And it's important to understand your audience here. We can't persuade all our fellow citizens without understanding what they're thinking. Americans think that the federal government in general, or in the abstract, is corrupt, partisan, bloated, wasteful. But whatever the reason for them to react that way, generalizations about the word government are based on biases and preconceptions that are just about impossible to erase in persuadable voters' heads. The solution is not to argue against those generalizations and try to say a government is honest, government is frugal. You can't win that way. You win by taking a different approach, by being consistent with what people are thinking. And here's one example of what people are actually thinking. Americans support government when you talk about specific policies or values or goals. In some cases, partisanship plays a major part. So, people want government to play a major role, and they're really thinking here about federal government in keeping the country safe from terrorism, responding to national disasters, ensuring safe food and medicine, managing the immigration system, maintaining infrastructure. They're all very, very strong. Then you start to get to some that are more partisanized, but still the average is quite strong. So people actually want government to do things. And then you get another example of being specific versus general when you talk about budget cuts. If you ask whether government should cut budgets across the board, and this is true of federal, state, or local government, voters are going to tend to say yes because of just the generality in their head. But if you ask about specific uses of money, voters want more spending, not less. If you look, this is the federal government, the least popular, and all the progressive causes do extremely well. I mean, they're all more positive than negative, except for aid to the world's needy, and people have always had a very weird idea about how much money we spend on foreign aid. In every other case, people are on our side. They don't want to cut spending. And in fact, there's a belief, there has been a belief, a wide belief that people don't like specific agencies like the EPA. But this poll shows that no, that's not true at all. That people pretty heavily favor well-known federal enforcement agencies, which means that if you're talking about state government, they'd be even more in favor. It's simply not true that people have a problem. And this is, again, a situation where when you, the theory versus practice, when you specific, people are in favor of what government does. It's not an abstraction. They know what the EPA is, or they think they do. And our Cylinder Lake poll shows that this is especially true when you tell stories. So, abstraction's the least persuasive way to talk about government. The most persuasive way is to tell a very real story to your audience, like the lead in the water in Flint, Michigan, or the chemical spill in Charleston, West Virginia, if you remember that. Things that they know that government needs to handle these things and prevent harm, and they're all in favor of government being active. When it comes to these things, the stories are the most persuasive thing, especially if you have them in your locality or your state, things that people are familiar with in their own, that they own, that they feel ownership for. And that's the most powerful way to get people to like or appreciate government. So I'm just going to go 3 more slides, and then I'm going to pause for questions. These are more general about persuasion. Generally, political science is based on the assumption that people mostly act rationally, and that their political opinions and the way they vote are based on self-interest. But that's not reality. It doesn't work that way. Everyone carries in their heads a long list of pre-existing beliefs, stereotypes, and biases, and that's true of all parties. We hold on to our beliefs despite self-interest and in the face of facts. Your listeners, consciously or unconsciously, are seeking out information that conforms to their pre-existing beliefs, while inside their minds they ignore or refute information that seems to disprove those beliefs. It's a selective use of evidence in which they reinforce to themselves what they already think. The reason why I have this picture here, why Sir Francis Bacon is featured, is that he wrote about it. It's called confirmation bias. This is something that has been known by people of science for 400 years. There is a very great body of scientific proof that confirmation bias exists and has a tremendous impact on people. And really, this is the factor that has the greatest impact on persuasion, period. That if you run up against someone's confirmation bias, if you trigger someone's confirmation bias, then they stop listening to you. But fortunately, there is a way around. Americans have a love-hate relationship with government, and our job is to trigger the beliefs that are already inside their brains that support an activist government. We know that people tend to dislike government in the abstract, but like it when we get specific. The traditional advice, therefore, is to avoid the sausage-making process and talk about the sausage. Now, I'm going to take questions about that. That's the traditional discussion of what we do about Americans not liking government. And then when I finish with these questions, I'm going to go to the new polling and show how there's something more that we can do.
And if folks have any questions, clarification around the stuff that Bernie has just presented, which will ground us in how do we put into action, or how do we use the information that Bernie will be walking us through to make a stronger case and help propel and support and motivate voters to support the solutions we're advocating for. You can type questions in the question bar, or click on the hand icon to raise your hand if you have audio capabilities, and we can take those questions as they come.
And remember that you can pull up the slides from your from the bar on the side. It's not every slide that I'm showing, but it's every slide that has polling data or recommendations based upon the polling. And it's quite a, you'll see this quite a lot, so you'll probably want to have that. Not that you have to follow along with it, but after we're finished, I think you'll want to have that.
Great. We have a question. I mean, Bill has posed the question: do conservatives really believe that free market capitalism is part of the traditional American values in the Constitution?
Yes.
Yes, next question.
You understand that people believe a lot of irrational things, but that doesn't mean they don't believe them. I mean, look at this election. People are well, okay, take a look at a poll that says that people think that Trump is more trustworthy than Hillary Clinton, or that she tells more lies than he does, and that kind of thing. I mean, facts are not what drives politics.
Right. And I think just to underscore this, in making sure everyone's grounded in this, I mean, this notion of confirmational bias, which is something that dates back a very long time. But there's a biological thing that's also happened, in that people are inundated with lots of information in a way so that you're not overloaded with stimulus. You find a way to connect things in a way that you comfortably, that you can rationalize. So it's already, you come into a place with ingrained beliefs, and you get enough information to reinforce what you already believe. And this is something that we need to recognize when we're engaging with the public around these ideas. And I think it's something that's going to be very helpful too. As progressives trying to make our case moving forward, is to understand this phenomenon is happening, and then how do you respond to it accordingly. We have We've got a number of questions that are starting to come through here, so I'm going to just go through them as they've come through. Why do conservatives believe that government should be run like a business, and how do you counter that idea? What type of story do you tell to push back against what the role of government should be?
Um,
And that's from Jacqueline.
yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question. It is hard to push back about something like government should be run like a business. What you're better off doing is to try to reframe the conversation with what your goal is. So you try to move it from, what government should be run like to, we really need our local schools to be among the best in the world. So how do we get there? What you want to do is you want to get people playing on your playing field, get them to agree to the goal that we're seeking to get to, and then you can show that a normal business process, whatever, is not going to get us there, but our solution will.
Good response there. Kevin asks, how can progressives use fear to our advantage? And, and he brings it in the context. It seems like this is definitely something that conservative minds and conservative leaders are predisposed to use fear or responding to fear. How does, I guess, that notion of fear relate to the information that that you presented, Bernie?
You're absolutely right. I think that our legislation, our policy, doesn't generally fit very well with fear. It works better with mobilizing our base. So I think that people should be pretty darn scared about this election, and getting people involved is a process of engaging their fears. But when you're talking about how we're going to get cleaner air, or how we're going to get stronger schools, or anything that's a progressive policy, I think it's, generally speaking, it's very hard to use fear for our side, and it's really the other side's ball game. Can you, Dave, I don't know if you can think of any good examples.
I mean, I think that there are, and I think as we go through the presentation and how to talk about the role of government and using the enforcement frame, moving forward, some of the stuff will be lifted up. I think the Flint water crisis, and most people know I'm based in Michigan, very dominant almost every day of our life from a media spectrum, but it was a national story. The fear of what can happen to our children, the fear of what's cut off. I think that there is definitely openings, and I think that Kevin is absolutely right. I mean, this is definitely something that is designed in many ways. I mean, the conservative mindset activates the people's fear as give me the power to make these decisions, and with less confidence in people being able to make decisions and government being able to make decisions and fulfill its roles and responsibilities. So I think that there are events that and maybe consequences of taking a different path on a host of policy discussions. This can happen if but I mean, frankly, those are the confirmational bias to be more prone to things going to happen for me, things going to be taken away from me, and the conservative mindset are just that, predisposed to having that activated. And I would say that those more on the left are less triggered by that. Turner asks a question, how do we know when we've triggered someone's confirmational bias? I think this is very actually, I mean, it's an interesting question. The context as a public leader engaging with an audience, door-to-door conversation with a persuadable voter. How do you know you've tripped into it? Like, what are the cues to be looking for and realizing on some level you're not, it's not worth the fight because they're already over there, versus deciding to actively engage and apply some of the techniques that you talked about.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you're one-on-one, you can sometimes see it in their face. But I think that when it seems that it's no longer a rational argument, it's a gut argument, it's unlikely that you can move them. What you really want to do is to try to understand what's the best chance of not triggering them. For example, you know, saying you're wrong is going to trigger the emotional response. If you can find something that starts the conversation where you and the other person is in agreement, they're in agreement about your goals or your values, that's your best chance of not triggering confirmation bias.
All right, I think we've gotten through most of the questions, Bernie. Why don't we move to the next session? If there are additional questions as it relates to this foundational work that that Bernie's talking about, feel free to continue to ask them. But let's move into some of this polling information that I think will confirm some things that we probably already believe, but present it in such a way that I think creates some openings in how we can better talk about the solutions we're advocating for.
Great. So this poll is from Celinda Lake of Lake Research Partners, which Celinda is one of the very best pollsters in America. She was commissioned to do this by the Bauman Foundation, who does a lot of other great work. And so I'm going to be copying many of the Lake Research graphics directly, and I just want to make sure you understand who deserves credit here. So instead of leaving you in suspense, and you know, this is an awful lot of text on this screen. Let me tell you the conclusions of the research right up front. This is new work. Americans support, quote, enforcement, unquote. Among many, there was a perception that Americans were feeling that government's overreaching, like agencies, the EPA or the FDA, that they're out of control, that they're running amok, that they're killing jobs, because that's the right-wing narrative. It turns out that's emphatically not true. Americans want more enforcement, not less. Their problem with enforcement, Americans have a problem that it's not being applied fairly. People think the rich and powerful can get away with whatever they want, and that they can break the rules. And that's what people think, and you know, they are right. And it's our job to agree with people and make them understand that it's our policies that will make enforcement fair. Interestingly, this finding doesn't just apply to enforcement of laws and regulations that are on the books. That is, you know, what you would normally think of as enforcement. It can also be used to justify new laws and regulations. And that's because Americans don't really understand the difference between laws and regulations. They don't really know the difference between making laws and regulations stricter and having stricter enforcement of what's on the books. So I'll show you how that works when we get to a specific narrative. So here's, you know, basic favor oppose. People overwhelmingly like rules and regulations. Rules is the stronger language, but they all work. In this question, the phrase enforcement of regulations turns out to be less effective, but other polling finds that the reason why they were less interested in this language when asked at this time in the poll is that they didn't think that regulations were fairly enforced. So they answered less favorably. But it works. This is because cynicism against government, these are just a couple of the standard things that people were saying in focus groups, that basically the rich can get away with violating rules or regulations. Federal enforcement is extremely popular. So this was, here's the questions along the bottom. Do you think that increased enforcement of national laws and regulations is a good thing or a bad thing? 71-14. That's incredible. That's amazing. And if you look at Republicans, they're 63-19. They're, completely with us. This one slide astonishes people. But, that's what people actually want. State enforcement, if you're talking about state or if you're talking about local, would be even more popular. In this case, state is 74-10, with 55% strongly. This is really a strong result. When asked whether they actually work, there is no uprising here about an out-of-control federal government. And Republicans think that laws and regulations work by 2-1. Despite conventional wisdom, a majority of voters are concerned that there's too little enforcement of laws and regulations. This is federal. With independents, voters in the South, Democrats, and women, the most ardent in this belief. So people think that there's too little, not too much. Three more slides, and then I'll take questions again. When given a three-way choice, look at too tough. How do people react to enforcement of laws and regulations in the U.S. is too tough? 8%. People don't feel that way at all. Men, women, it's a question of the standard conservative argument. Just nobody believes it, even standard conservatives. 2/3 of voters think that enforcement is unequally or unfairly applied. A smaller percentage worry that it hurts small businesses and that it's costly and ineffective. Equality and fairness have the greatest intensity. Not equally applied, not fairly applied. To see the intensity, 40%, 38%. So when people are digging down into what they're feeling about enforcement, the progressive arguments work, and the only thing that we really have to be particularly concerned about is making sure that people don't perceive that our enforcement hurts small businesses. That's the other side's strongest argument. And it's not as strong an argument as equality and fairness. The best word to describe enforcement, they all work. Now, toughest doesn't work as well, but still works. Fair, more equal, common sense, proper. Everybody is in favor of stronger enforcement. So I'm going to stop there because that's sort of the meat of this poll, the thing that people didn't expect when they took this poll. And the thing that you can use most as a practical matter. And all those slides are part of this download here, so you can study them at your leisure.
And if people have any questions, please raise your hand or type questions in the question bar. Tarn asks a question, Bernie, right off the bat. Did this polling give examples of or differentiate between types of enforcement? I think enforcement, like law enforcement, regulatory enforcement, legal enforcement. Was there some distinguishing factor as relates to that?
Not broken out that way, but you'll see that there are slides about certain areas where people feel the strongest. When you're talking about environmental quality, clean water, clean air, that I think there are a couple of slides later on that may answer that question adequately, but it is not exactly what is being asked.
And I mean, Bernie, the kind of like some of the revelation out of here that that I found pretty compelling is that that people in general think that the government has a role to protect people, to protect community, to level the playing field, enforce the rules, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, at the same time, that in our messaging stuff, when we talk about government, that we don't use words like government because it automatically has, the trigger that feeds into a confirmational bias that can often compromise the solutions that we're trying to advance. So how do, what ideas or suggestions do you have to kind of reconcile those two things?
I think that the main concept that you're trying to get across is leveling the playing field, not just in economics, but fundamental fairness for all, and that you're not going to let the rich and powerful have a different set of rules. That's the kind of stricter enforcement that people want, because they think that, well, average people are stuck having to enforce the rules. They just have a problem with rich and powerful getting out of it. So, rules works, level the playing field works, even regulations works. I wouldn't say the government, I'd say we need to do this, or society needs to do this, or it's just there's no point in triggering biases against the word government.
And what I found very compelling, and I've seen candidates and elected leaders on the left and the right equally use the tool, meaning, maybe like this confirmational bias that exists, that, government is not, or I guess locked into this idea that government part of the problem. The frame that, you looked up at the beginning of, the presentation. What makes it, what's compelling is if we talk about the role and function that we want government to play, we lift up this enforcement frame, it does begin to give us an opportunity to reframe the role of government in a way that we know actually meets public support already. And potentially, as you talked in, in the previous, question and answer period, to move the conversation onto a field that's much more favorable for government playing the role in advancing equality, advancing economic opportunity. And you go down the list of the policy solutions that you're talking about, and that's what I found really, really exciting about this. And I think it's something that all the people joining us around the country are joining us today start thinking about how to put this information in a way. And I know the next session we're going to go into messaging. How do we use it to basically start change the narrative of what the role of government is, without using the trigger words that bring us back into a much more defensive position. From a messaging point, Tim, poses, and I think this is very good. How about this? Make government once again work for we the people to do its role, and then you can actually go and basically talk about whatever the specific role that the enforcement role of government that we're talking about.
Yeah, but I think it would be stronger to start right out with whatever it is that you're trying to push. So, American families need, we all need to have a living, be able to access a living wage, or we all need to have safe neighborhoods, or we have to ensure that our workplaces are safe. Whatever it is that what we want to talk about, that's the best way to lead the conversation. Is what is the policy goal that you want to talk about? Because then people are starting on your side. Then you're not really talking about government as an abstraction, and they get it.
Mm-hmm. We have another question and comment, and this relates a little bit to some of the stuff you're talking about in terms of the powerful interests, wealthy, powerful interests have. And Bill talks about how Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, others have really lifted up the influence of the wealthy on the government, money in politics, all of those things. I guess, how does voters on the right respond to that? The kind of the money in politics corrupting the overall system. And I guess look from an enforcement frame, if government's supposed to be leveling the playing field, how does it resonate in the context from this enforcement frame of trying to make sure that powerful interests don't overwhelm the little guy?
Yeah. Well, conservatives agree, not as strongly as progressives, but conservatives are pretty strongly in favor, and they do believe the message about the rich and powerful being a big problem. And in fact, Trump made a great deal of hay in the primaries by saying, I'm not going to be susceptible to that kind of pressure because I have the money that I don't need. Don't need anybody's help. And he said a lot of things that were kind of populist in that way, that weren't too far off from the way that Bernie Sanders was talking. The problem with those conservatives is that when given the choice of blaming the rich and powerful or blaming Muslims and Latinos, they jump on blaming Muslims and Latinos. It's more real to them. They believe it faster. That's what they learn on Fox News. They don't have the data in their heads to access, to support the idea that it's the rich and powerful that are keeping them down, although they tend to believe it. But the thing that's top of their mind is these groups are keeping me down. That's our problem. They are susceptible to our message, but they're more susceptible to their message.
Great answer, Bernie. Thank you. I think it covers everything. Why don't we move into the last section here, where we put this data into practice and give us, the frame and how most effectively to use this information as a tool to help advance progressive political policy change.
Excellent. So, what you want to do, as we've said, avoid talking about government as an abstraction, focus on talking about what government accomplishes, find examples in your own state or locality of failures where you can explain the problem and call for a specific enforcement solution, and use this language we've been talking about as an overall theme for your current political efforts. You're saying that there are serious problems to fix, and we can fix them. So, you can do this in, let's say, your state. I'm sure you can find some story, some problem that fits the enforcement frame, and it'll work for you. It can be about public health and safety, or about infrastructure, about protected consumers. That's what you're trying to accomplish. So, there's a lot of stuff on this slide. The point is that there's a whole lot of things that you could research in your own state or locality. There are a lot of policy areas where you can make a strong argument about enforcement. We would be glad to work with you if you were to find something in your state or locality that you wanted to make as the point of this argument. And not only do we have messaging expertise, but we have access to experts, subject matter experts in all these areas, and we could, we would be eager to help you create that story and launch, a little campaign to use this. Here's a kind of amazing poll question. It's standard to compare your narrative with the opponent's narrative. If you just test your own side, then you get information that doesn't withstand a debate. If you can read both sides' talking points and then see where people are, you get a much more accurate view of whether a message, an overall message, works. And this one is kind of extraordinary. If you look at, explaining our message kind of as a theme, and reading the opponent's message, their theme, you would think that their theme would do pretty well. I mean, it gives their standard argument about free markets and, out-of-touch bureaucrats, the whole business. But when you ask this, do you favor this or that, our side wins 80-16. That's amazing. That's an amazing difference. And if you look at what are the examples that are within the progressive narrative here, about prohibiting big banks from destroying the economy, stopping the credit card industry from charging hidden fees, preventing the wealthiest from from offshore tax havens. This isn't, this isn't necessarily quote enforcement unquote that you may have been thinking about. You may have been thinking about, oh, there's some law in the books and we need to use this messaging in order to get the state to enforce that regulation on everyone. Yes, that works. But the point here is that people feel more broadly about this, that a kind of a populist argument that includes, they see this as enforcement, stopping the credit card industry from charging hidden fees, but it's actually legislation. Now, when asked a different way, instead of kind of the populist way, it talks about what the problem, protecting people from these problems. Funny thing is, still works. It works 75 to 21, but the more populist version works 80 to 16. So I have to recommend that that's better. But even when you do this, about talking about preventing dangers, it still works wonderfully well. It's kind of amazing. And this is, after a simulated debate. Our side wins either way. So you'll see the difference here is in the independence. There is an argument to be made that although overall people prefer the populist argument, if you are engaged in just persuading independents, the prevention argument does seem to be more intense, with 61% strongly favoring. Don't know whether that's a good enough reason to pick the prevention rather than the populist argument, but it is there. To be honest, it is a consideration. So this is just something for you to have among the handouts. It lists out what the arguments are, and matching them up against the opposition arguments, so that you can see, our side defeating the other side, what it is that's working. So voters believe that that there are certain areas where enforcement is more effective. And this is sort of what I was referring to, this slide that shows that it works the best with preventing deadly mistakes, saving lives, protecting the vulnerable like seniors and children, and going down to the bottom, preventing financial markets from hurting the economy is still reasonably strong. I'm just gonna go through these because you will have these yourself. So works best with clean water, food and drugs, and while voters would also go to laws and regulations regarding lobbyists and special interests, it's just not as intense if you make the argument that way. Maybe it is not as real to them. Maybe it starts to become abstract for them. The more real you can make it, the more practical, the more solid that they see how it affects their lives, the better it works. And again, this one is another rating of what works the best, really. Clean water, food and drugs, civil rights, drugs, nuclear energy, going down to, even the home mortgage industry still works, just not nearly as effectively, not nearly as intensively. Finally, I want to talk about this communication through storytelling. What the poll did was it asked people, it told these stories. These were instances where, at the time the poll was taken, people might have been familiar with them. And they all worked. In fact, they worked tremendously. So that when the story was told about in West Virginia where the plant had chemicals and they leaked out into the drinking water, and everybody in Charleston was affected, that 90% thought it was very or totally convincing, and it just showed that the more real you make it, the more practical, by telling a story, especially a local story, especially a story that they've heard of, it just blows people away. And then these are the case studies that they actually used. So I'm just showing you, these are in the slides. You can see exactly what people said and what they were reacting to, and they all worked wonderfully well, but they're listed in the order of intensity. Some people like to see things as a messaging triangle, so it's laid out as a messaging triangle about how to use this information, how to react within an argument. Anyway, I went through the last part quickly because really you just have to read the slides yourselves to understand the significance of one versus the other, but we're giving you the slides.
And I think everyone knows the ritual. If you have any questions, I think this begins putting this fairly new research into, framing it and putting it into practice to help support this overall work. And it's, I think the nuance here matters. It confirms some things that I think intrinsically we already knew. And now I think that there's some qualitative data to affirm and give us confidence about what things work better. So if you have any questions, type your questions in the question bar. And we'll wait for that, or raise your hand if you have audio capabilities and can ask them directly. And Bernie, while people are maybe thinking of some questions, can you also give, I guess, for those who joined us a little bit later, the context, like how recent this information is?
This particular poll is a year old. There is a follow-up study that's going into the field right after the election. We expect it to have the same results, but that it'll add detail, and we will make that available when it is.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm not seeing any questions come through. We'll do one more final call. If you have questions, you can type questions in the question bar or raise your hand. You all have access to all the polling related information as an attachment to your control panel. So maybe people are scrolling through that and being able to draw, maybe develop additional questions. You can always reach out to Bernie and myself by going to our website, publicleadershipinstitute.org. Again, I think I said this before, that I think it's the compelling information here that gives us an opportunity to redefine the role of government and talk about the reforms that we're championing in a way that meets voters where they already are and puts into practice the best practice persuasion messaging work that Bernie talked about earlier. I think is very useful, and some concrete tools and a general strategy how to support this work going forward. So we really want to encourage you to practice put into the real world as part of your collective work to move the needle in the direction of economic and social justice. And we want to, and please give us the feedback about how this is working. Where are you getting caught up? What's working best? What's not working as well? This is a work in progress in many ways, and I think some new information to be able to help inform us how to do that. So with that, Bernie, I want to say thank you for taking us through this, and I want to thank everyone for sticking with us and going pretty deep into some of this data and research, but hopefully that it's something that can there's some useful tools and information to put into practice to help support your work. So thanks again, Bernie, for everything.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Well, that will conclude Public Leadership Institute's webinar this afternoon. Please join us. You can usually find us around this time every other week. Look in your inbox for our next webinar, and you can also find copies of this presentation up on our website, as well as a host of resources that we talked about at the top of the hour about supporting your work to advance progressive policy solutions in your community and state. Thank you again, and until next time, have a good one.